In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human, without access to any senses or ways to perceive stimuli, would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the 5 senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human would actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all of his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. The scientists watched him as he spoke aloud about a state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was the onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued but were not convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of the scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for 3 days until he started having severe night terrors. And the subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point, he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing connection with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientists rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to a table so he couldn't kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head and, despite being blind, made focused eye contact with a scientist for the first time in the study. He simply said, "I have spoken with God, and He has abandoned us." Mr. Wu was standing against the railing at the top of the stairs. He's been there for the last 3 nights when I get home from work. I live in one of those 5-story downtown apartment buildings that are always filled with a variety of characters. The woman with the 1,000,000 cats who's always wearing a worn-out robe, the man and woman who are constantly fighting and then making up, the mother with the screaming children, the neighbors that you never see but can hear fragments of their daily lives as you walk down the hall. And then there's always a Mr. Wu. I've been working late for the past week trying to get a story written and ready for print for the Dark County Gazette about the strange disappearances of a couple local guys. I finally finished it tonight and was making my way up the stairs to my apartment on the 3rd floor, when there he was, just standing there. He was holding on to the old metal banister and looking at me with an almost pleading urgency. I really didn't know Mr. Wu very well. I had only seen him a few times just in passing, and aside from a nod or a quiet hello, he would usually just shuffle on by. This time was different. He almost seemed upset and saddened. I wondered if everything was alright with him. Maybe he was waiting for someone. As I approached, he held out a hand to stop me and opened his mouth to speak. Nothing really came out but a few small gurgled noises. "Are you okay, Mr. Wu? Is there something I can do for you?" He looked frustrated and began pointing down the hallway. He seemed fine last night and the night before, like he was just standing there waiting on something. "Do you need some help? Is there someone I can call?" More frantic pointing. I looked down the dimly lit hallway and couldn't see anything abnormal. I looked back to tell him, and I noticed that one of his eyes has turned this strange milky white color. Mr. Wu just continued to point towards our apartments. Mine was the third door on the left, and his was the fifth on the right. "Is there someone bothering you? Did someone break into your apartment?" His hands started flailing in frustration towards the hall, like I wasn't listening to him at all. I grabbed at his arm, but somehow missed. I could have sworn I grabbed him, but it was like my hand passed right through his arm. He started walking at that point, slowly shuffling his way down the hall in his dirty gray slippers. He kept stopping, turning around, and motioning for me to follow. I sighed, giving in, and followed him. I dropped my bag and jacket off in front of my door and continued down to where he was standing in front of his. He motioned towards the door. Were both of his eyes this milky just a minute ago? I thought to myself. "Are you locked out or something? Do you need me to call the super?" He just motioned towards the door and did a turn with his wrist. I put my hand on the doorknob and looked back at Mr. Wu. He had a different look on his face this time. There wasn't any panic or frustration, but calm and a slight smile. He motioned for me to continue. I turned the knob and slowly opened the door and looked back. Mr. Wu was gone. I was alone there in the corridor. I reached into his apartment and flicked on the light switch. And there was Mr. Wu, lying on his living room floor. His face was twisted in panic and his eyes were milky white. He was dead.